Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And today is Friday, and it's time for our weekly roundup of stories. Um, I hope that you are having a wonderful Friday. I hope you've had a wonderful week. I do have a couple of interesting stories for today. Um, and I hope that maybe you'll have a few to add to it. The first story that I have today is to introduce a new show that's coming here to our network, which is called Pagan News. And this show will be premiering on Sunday at 3 p.m. Central or 4 p.m. Eastern. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a show on news for a pagan audience. It is a collaboration that will be airing on Corellian TV, Divination TV, Witchcraft TV, and Pagan TV. And will involve myself, Reverend Mary Hawk, Chris Copeland, and Harold Carter. And I think that it will be a fascinating program. We're going to look at different things in the news, different stories of interest. It will be airing once a month. And that, for me, is our first story. And I want to talk a little bit about the idea of pagan news. As long as I have been involved in pagan media, um, I've always been involved with organizations that have at least some focus on the idea of pagan news. Um, Ed the Pagan and I worked together for many years on many media projects that focused on pagan news. And I've worked independently on these as well. And hello to Nikki in the chat room. It's good to see you, Nikki. All the way back to the Wheel of Hecate, we had a section devoted to pagan news. The magazine Psychic Chicago had a section on news. The magazine The Round Table in Chicago had a section on news. And everything we've done online has always had a certain focus on news. Hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. If you look back on Magic TV, and hello to Reverend Mary in the chat room, you'll see many programs that we've done over the years that focused on subjects that would be considered news, both community news and national news of interest to the community. One of the ones that was most fascinating was Patrick McCullum and his fight with the prison industry over how pagans were treated in dealing with the prison industry. We've had a number of interesting stories of that in the past when it was going on. We've often talked about different legislative things happening, as we recently talked on this program about the recent IVF ruling. And so we've always tried to focus on that sort of thing. Way back in the 1980s, during the Wheel of Hecate, we focused on the Helms Amendment, which we've often talked about here. And hello to Ozma in the chat room. It's good to see you, Ozma. One of the things I've found, however, is that a certain portion of the pagan community really seems to want to avoid all news of the outside world. And although on one level I kind of get that, it really is a statement about what the path means to us as individuals. For some people, I think this is a path of escapism. For others, it's our actual religion and life path. If it's our actual life path, then news is important to us. What's going on in the world is important to us, especially when it comes to legal issues and things going on in the law. In the pagan news broadcast, that's one of the things we will often focus on, although not every segment and not every time. Some of the segments will be a little more entertainment oriented, some will be more local stories, others national or international, to give a wide range of things that are happening. In my career, I have often focused on both. Um, and Reverend Mary says, "We aren't ostriches." Get your head out of the sand. But it's true that I've often said I've often quoted the famous phrase that you may not be concerned with politics, but that doesn't mean politics will not be concerned with you. Ignoring these things is something we do at our own danger, and I want to emphasize the importance of news. So this will be a once a month broadcast. I hope that you will watch it, and hope that you will be entertained by it, but also informed about important things. And I think that you will find that there are a lot of things going on right now that are important to our community. And hello to Erica in the chat room. Erica says, first time watcher here. Sounds good. Thank you, Erica. We're very happy to have you with us. Um, you know, Corellian TV was formerly Magic TV. We've been going now for 20 years. Um, and more or less 20 years. And we have covered a lot of events. And hello to Lady Kai in the chat room. It's good to see you, Kai. And those they've ranged from more specifically Corellian events like the annual illustrations to national events, both ritual and festival wise. We have often covered events like the St. Louis Pagan Picnic, for example. We covered Pantheacon a couple of times when that was still going on. We've covered a number of other festivals, one-time events like the Chicago Pagan Unity Night some 20 years ago. Hello to Bimby in the chat room. It's good to see you, Bimby. And many other things like that, but also, again, actual political news that affects our community. And it is important to us not to ignore this, like the recent IVF ruling. And if you remember what we had to say about that, it's a manifestation of that rise of Christian dominionism, or what's perhaps more commonly now called Christian nationalism, which is a serious threat to our community and to all minority religions, because there is no room in the world that those people want for any minority religion. Um, we covered a few weeks ago a story involving a Corellian priestess being falsely accused of being a Satanist by a politician who seemed to be trying to revive the Satanic Panic. And in that story, we talked a lot about what the Satanic Panic was, why it's still important to us, and why it's very important we not let it have a second life. But in talking to that person, they pointed out very bluntly that in their world, in the Christian dominionist world, there was no room for any other religion, even for Judaism, which is a closely related religion, except in very limited terms. And that should be a source of concern for all Americans, not just for pagans, but especially for us, because we're very directly influenced by it. And hello to Christine in the chat room. So this is something you will probably see um, covered on the Pagan News program in various points in the future. I believe one of the stories on Sunday does kind of deal with that, although for the most part the other stories do not. Um, but we're going to talk about whatever seems interesting and relevant at the time of the broadcast. So again, coming on Sunday at 3 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Eastern, and it will be a great time. I think that you will enjoy it. My second story today is kind of related in the sense that it deals with conspiracy theories. Have you seen the stories from conspiracy theorists that the coming eclipse will be a massive human sacrifice event? Hello to Maria in the chat room. It's good to see you. Um, Speaking of the Satanic Panic, this is related to that. The fantasy that there is a huge satanic movement that somehow is completely invisible and completely unseen, except for the handful of conspiracists. But in this case, it's even a little more bizarre in that the idea, um, what they're describing as a massive human sacrifice, is supposedly technological in character, and it is around the idea that if you overlay the path of the totality of this coming eclipse and the last one, um, and what relevance these have to one another, I don't quite understand, but they form an X near the New Madrid fault line. And, um, and the idea that there is a satanic plan to artificially trigger that fault line, creating massive earthquakes and loss of human life, which is absolutely crazy. But then the entire satanic panic was crazy. And a certain number of people seem to believe this nonsense. Now, of course, on Tuesday, they're going to feel very foolish, as they usually do, but they'll have an explanation for why it didn't happen. Others are saying that it's going to be the rapture again. I thought that already happened, actually. I seem to remember that back in the teens. I remember lots of photos of empty clothes laying around. In fact, I think I remember posting some. So if you ask me, that already happened, but some of them who apparently didn't go think it's still coming, and they think that's going to be triggered by the eclipse. So there's a lot of paranoid nonsense going on about the eclipse. And Bimby says, I haven't seen that one, but I've seen other nonsense about it. So, this conspiracy theory isn't the only one going around. Um, Nor do I think is the rapture one the only one going around. It does speak to some things that I think are very important. The first, again, is the fact that a certain segment of this society is itching for another satanic panic. And, things are even more volatile now than they were during the last satanic panic. And it could be very bad news if that were actually to happen. Um, would it actually touch our community? I don't see any reason to think it wouldn't. At the very least, um, it will influence our community, which it did before, by making people afraid, even if most of us were not directly influenced by it, but a few people were. Um, but our pagan movement today is far more public, and people like myself are very public and easy to find. A return to the satanic panic um, is not necessarily good. Now, Reverend Mary in the chat room says, if the Christian nationalists get raptured, the rest of us can live together peacefully. Um, well, there is that, isn't there? Um, but that somehow never seems to actually happen. Um, I don't know how many raptures I've lived through um, in this lifetime, not to mention those that occurred before the start of this lifetime for me. And somehow it never seems to be complete. But that never seems to make a difference to them. And one more failed rapture um, will give us something to perhaps chuckle about, but it's not going to derail their train. And we need to be watching their train. We need to be, at this point, we really need to be thinking of how we're going to respond to the things that they're doing, because we missed our chance to do anything to head it off. Um, Even in the best case scenario, they're now very powerful and have achieved a large number of their goals already. Um, and in a lot of ways, for us, the question now is how do we survive this period? And if possible, continue to thrive during it. Um, I think there are ways, but that way is not by burying our head in the sand. It is not by ignoring the situation, um, nor is it by thinking that we're going to somehow head them off. Again, I think it's too late to do that. They got what they needed. And now it's a matter of how fast and how thoroughly they can implement their agenda. And that remains to be seen. But they have many of the tools in place to do so no matter what happens. For example, in the coming elections, it would be very hard to disrupt them now. In the future, that might be different. Um, but right now, they've largely succeeded at what they wanted to do while we were busy arguing with each other. And I think the biggest thing I would say for future generations is to remember that lesson. Just because you choose to put your time into internecine arguments over nonsense, which most of these arguments were over personal political differences or political aspirations or liturgical differences, even worse, um, or subjects of identity. That doesn't mean that um, your enemies are going to be arguing among themselves, and it does not necessarily mean that you have an endless period of time to organize in opposition to what other groups might be doing. And we still have, as I say, I believe, a way forward, a number of ways forward. But what we don't have is a lot of time to just sit around and argue. Um, that those ways forward may be for us as a community. It may be individually for different traditions. It may be that we can't work together. Um, that doesn't necessarily mean that no one can do anything. But the one thing we can't do is just ignore it, in my opinion. So you'll hear me come back to this many times as we go forward, as I have historically. And I have to tell you, so many times when I talk about this subject, the reaction I've gotten from the pagan community is they don't want to hear about it, or worse, they don't believe it. And if you can be reading current headlines and not believe and understand this situation, I don't know what to tell you. Um, because it's about as plain as it can be. Like I say, what's a little less plain is what is our path forward as Christian nationalism continues to become more powerful. Uh, it is possible that it could yet be set back, but the problem is they've achieved so many of their goals, they can only be set back so far. Um, in particular, the dominance of the Supreme Court. So, this is a subject, again, that, as I say, we will come back to. And we'll see lots of conspiracy theories because they live on conspiracy theories. They use conspiracy theories to advance their agenda. Um, and I'm sure we'll see a dozen more raptures during our lifetime. Um, it seems to be a constant theme. So, we have that going on. And those were my two primary stories for today. Um, and I thought that they were very interesting to look at. There are, of course, lots of other things going on in the world, and but I think those were the two that I really wanted to touch on. And Kimberly in the chat room says they sell fear. Yes, and that's exactly what we're looking at. That's what these conspiracy theories are about. That's what all of these raptures are about. That's what this nonsense about um, satanic panic and human sacrifice um, associated with an eclipse and so forth. It's all about fear. Because if you're afraid, You're going to be looking for powerful protectors. And for people who don't have their own power, who don't trust their own power, because in the end, we all have our own spiritual power. But if you don't know that, if you don't trust that, uh, they will try to get you to come under theirs. And that's why they encourage fear. Now, what have we been doing this last 10 years? Our Corellian Peace Campaign. What is the Peace Campaign? Promoting energies of love and peace versus energies of hate and fear. We started the Peace Campaign in the belief that certain groups were intentionally disseminating fear as far and wide as they could for their own purposes, for their own political purposes primarily. And I think if you look back over this last 10 years or so, it's extremely evident now. Um, I think if you're of a certain age and you can remember the world 30 years ago, you'll remember it was very different in some ways. Now, of course, we had constant controversy, we had all kinds of political differences and opposition, but we had a lot less fear mongering at that time. There certainly were people doing it, but it seems to be, I won't say at an all time high, but probably an all time high for my lifetime. Uh, I will say it's always been an undercurrent and an undercurrent on the part of the same people. I remember 1976. Um, and of course, if you're old enough to remember the 60s, you'll remember a very similar atmosphere. And Janet says, I'm seeing on Facebook about human sacrifice because of the eclipse. Yes, it's all over the place. And there are people who actually believe this nonsense. And hello to Cheryl in the chat room. Cheryl says, love your insight. Thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate that. Um, but yeah, it's amazing to see the level of fear. I was going to say, though, that I remember um, when I was, what would I have been in 76? 13, I guess. There was a man here in Danville who was a friend of my father, more in the sense of an acquaintance. But he was a conspiracy theorist who handed out a regular newsletter about how the Soviet Union was soon going to take over the United States, and included things like the map of how they were going to redraw the country and all sorts of things which he spouted with such confidence. Um, and Sir Edward in the chat room says, we could see a shadow army summoned from all this fear. And yes, absolutely. Um, and part of what I would say to this, to our community, which understands spiritual things, is that we're not only talking about politics, we're talking about metaphysics. That this is a conflict which has been going on for a long time, and which is not entirely of this world. It is both physical and metaphysical. And do not think it's only political actions that are being taken. There's a lot of energetics going on, which is why the peace campaign. The idea of a shadow army. Um, I'm not necessarily certain what Sir Edward means, because it could be a couple of different things. Um, it could be an informal movement, or it could be a metaphysical force, and either one of them, I believe, is very much part of what we're dealing with. And so when I talk about how we're going to deal with this period, um, it's not just how do we survive politically, it's how do we defend ourselves metaphysically, it's how do we set forward our path, both politically and metaphysically. One of the things I've talked about with my upcoming ceremony for the eclipse on Monday is empowering the rebirth of our Corellian homeland here in the Danville area. But part of that also is setting forth metaphysically the path forward, creating that metaphysical road, um, that temporal ley line, if you would, that helps us to chart our path forward. I haven't really discussed that in detail until this moment, but that's part of what I am personally seeking to do in that ceremony and other ceremonies coming up, to create, again, a temporal ley line. Um, and Sir Edward says, I'm saying yes. Obviously, no, we know people who are creating fear acting as shadows, whisperers. We can see other manifestations. Absolutely. I am in total agreement with this. And we must take it into account in our actions going forward. Um, we cannot be ostriches with our heads in the sand dealing with this situation. And Kimberly says the book 1984 is the first one I remember. People believed it to be true, but nothing was said when it didn't happen. Yes, absolutely. Um, this kind of fear mongering, obviously, it's been going on for a long time. Y2K was a really big one. And when it didn't happen, a few people felt foolish. Mostly people just ignored it. Didn't happen. Um, but did it have an effect? I think if we look at the success of conspiracy theories today, yes, it did. Um, in fact, I was speaking with someone the other day who was talking about how their father still has mass amounts of survival food that they started collecting um, for Y2K, but continue to keep for the proposed Armageddon that they're certain is coming any day, and no doubt doing everything they can to provoke. And Sir Edward remarks that Nostradamus used to be big, but not so much anymore. It used to be people were constantly quoting Nostradamus and his various predictions. And yeah, I haven't heard Nostradamus recently, um, although Nostradamus is fascinating, both as a historical individual and in terms of their predictions. Um, but yes, he was used widely to disseminate conspiracy theories and fear. And why do people focus so heavily on disseminating fear? And to me, there are two answers. One, it helps them as individuals to feel more in control of their lives, that they alone are prepared for the horrible thing that's coming. That's a sense of power for them. But then there's the political aspect. And as I say, if you can get people to be afraid, you have a great deal of power over them. And so I would say to you, anytime you see a group of people disseminating hatred and fear and anger and distrust, they're seeking power over people. If you can get people into a state where they are in constant fear, constant anger, constant outrage, you can manipulate them much more easily than you could in any other circumstance. Um, and I think that's very much what we see happening in the world. Um, and Nikki says, um, in my opinion, it's fear mongering to control the masses. Basically, yeah, that's what I'm saying as well. And I do believe it has a strong metaphysical component we must not ignore. And hello to Steve in the chat room. And Steve says that they are watching late today. But as always, this program is recorded and will still be here perpetually. So with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. Um, this weekend, again, please join us for the Pagan News broadcast this evening. Reverend Mary will be doing the numerology of the eclipse on Divination TV. Please join her for that. And join me again on Monday for Midday with Reverend Don. And just before 1 p.m. Central, 2 p.m. Eastern, join me for our eclipse ritual. And we'll be talking about that on the program on Monday and doing it at the time of the greater totality over this area. So thank you for joining me, and let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to continue to be with us and help us not to be taken in by fear mongering, not to be deceived by hateful rhetoric, but to use our critical thinking skills to look at what is actually going on in the world around us. Help us not to be misled by demagogues and those who would control us for their own purposes, but to use our minds to control our own actions in sensible ways. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for this and for everything that you do for us in our lives, and we know that you're always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always, and I will see you for Midday with Reverend Don on Monday.